In the scorching deserts of New Mexico, where the sun burns mercilessly and water is more precious than gold, legends are born not from glory, but from the quiet moments when two souls recognize each other across impossible divides. This is the story of a man who had forgotten how to hope, and a woman who could see what others missed entirely. It's 1949, and in a world where trust comes at gunpoint and love is a luxury few can afford, sometimes the heart must lead when the eyes cannot see the way forward. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The desert wind carried dust devils across the mesa as Eli Hayes urged his weary horse toward the distant mountains. The animal's ribs showed through its dull coat, and Eli's own face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much sun and too little mercy. His broad-brimmed hat cast a shadow over eyes that had once been bright blue, but now held the gray weight of winter skies. The bounty posters called him a killer. They described a man who had gunned down 3 soldiers in cold blood outside Fort Sumner. What they didn't mention was that Eli Hayes had been trying to stop a massacre of Apache women and children when those soldiers drew their weapons. The truth, as it often did in 1949, had been buried under politics and prejudice. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, Eli spotted smoke rising from a valley below. Not the black smoke of trouble, but the thin, steady streams of cooking fires. His stomach cramped with hunger, but approaching any settlement meant risk. Still, his horse needed water, and Eli's own canteen had been empty since dawn. The Apache village nestled against red rock cliffs like a secret whispered by the earth itself. Adobe structures and traditional wickiups dotted the landscape, while children played in the shade of cottonwood trees that somehow thrived in this harsh land. Eli dismounted at the village edge, his spurs chiming softly in the evening air. An elderly Apache man emerged from the largest dwelling, his weathered face impassive as he studied the stranger. Behind him, other villagers gathered, their expressions ranging from curious to cautious. Eli raised his empty hands, a gesture of peace he hoped would be understood. "I'm not looking for trouble," Eli called out, his voice hoarse from thirst. "Just water for my horse and maybe some food. I can pay." The elder's eyes moved from Eli's face to the gun at his hip, then back again. Something in that ancient gaze reminded Eli of his grandfather, who had taught him that a man's true measure wasn't in what he carried, but in what he chose to put down. "You are far from the white man's trails," the elder said in careful English. "What brings you to our valley?" Before Eli could answer, a voice spoke from the shadows of a nearby dwelling. "He carries great sadness, grandfather, and fear, but not the kind that makes men dangerous to others." A young woman stepped into the fading light, and Eli's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful in the way desert flowers are beautiful, refined by hardship into something both delicate and resilient. Her long black hair was braided with small silver ornaments that caught the firelight, and she wore a traditional Apache dress adorned with intricate beadwork. But it was her eyes that struck Eli most profoundly. They were the color of desert amber, but they didn't quite focus on him or anything else. She was blind, yet somehow, she seemed to see him more clearly than anyone had in years. "This is my granddaughter, Awanata," the elder said, his voice carrying a note of pride mixed with protectiveness. "She has the gift of seeing what others cannot." Awanata moved forward with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and shadow in her world. She stopped just out of arm's reach, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "Your horse is tired," she said to Eli, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native language beneath the English words. "There is pain in his left front leg. Old injury." Eli glanced down at his mount, startled. The horse did favor that leg, but it was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. "How did you?" "I listen," Awanata said simply. "Your horse speaks of hard trails and little rest. You speak of the same things, though your words are different." The elder, whom Awanata had called grandfather, studied Eli with renewed interest. "You may water your horse at the stream. We will share food, but you will not stay the night. These are dangerous times for all of us." As Eli led his horse toward the sound of running water, he felt eyes following his every movement. Not just the wary gazes of the villagers, but something else, a presence that seemed to understand the weight he carried. When he glanced back, Awanata remained where she had been, her face turned toward him despite her blindness. The stream was clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that had carved this oasis from the desert stone. Eli's horse drank deeply while he splashed water on his face, washing away layers of dust and sweat. In the reflection, he saw a stranger, hollow-cheeked and hollow-eyed, more ghost than man. The water remembers every mountain it has touched. Awanata's voice came from behind him. She had approached so quietly that Eli's hand instinctively moved toward his gun before he caught himself. "I didn't hear you coming," he said, turning to face her. Most people don't. They listen with their ears instead of their hearts. She knelt beside the stream, her fingers trailing in the current. "You are running from something. Or someone." It wasn't a question, and Eli didn't treat it as one. Sometimes running is the only choice left. And sometimes, Awanata said, running becomes a prison with no walls. The evening meal was served around a central fire, where the warm light danced across faces that had known both hardship and endurance. Eli sat slightly apart from the main group, but close enough to feel the community's cautious hospitality. The food was simple but nourishing: cornbread, dried meat, and a stew that tasted of desert herbs and careful preparation. Awanata sat across from him, her movements graceful and purposeful as she ate. Occasionally, she would turn her face toward him, and Eli felt the strange sensation of being truly seen despite her blindness. It was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. "You fought in the war," she said suddenly, her voice carrying across the fire's crackle. Eli paused with a spoon halfway to his mouth. "What makes you say that?" "The way you hold yourself. The way you listen to sounds around you. My brother was the same when he returned from the Pacific." Her expression grew distant, before the fever took him. "I'm sorry for your loss." Awanata nodded, accepting the condolence. He used to say that the hardest part of coming home wasn't the memories of battle, but learning to live with peace again. "Is that why you run?" Eli set down his bowl, suddenly having lost his appetite. Around them, conversations continued in Apache and English, but he felt isolated in a bubble of unwanted understanding. "I don't know what you mean." "You carry the weight of decisions that seemed right at the time but feel wrong in memory," Awanata continued, her voice gentle but persistent. "You saved lives, but others were lost. You chose justice, but the world called it murder." The accuracy of her words hit Eli like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the ground. Several villagers looked up, their expressions wary. "I should go," he said, his voice tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Running again?" Awanata asked, but there was no judgment in her tone, only sadness. Eli was halfway to his horse when her grandfather intercepted him. The old man moved with surprising speed for his age, placing himself directly in Eli's path. "You will not leave tonight," the elder said firmly. "Storm comes. You can feel it in the air." Indeed, the wind had picked up, and the smell of rain, rare and precious in this land, carried on the desert breeze. Lightning flickered in the distance, still miles away, but approaching with the inexorable patience of desert weather. "I've ridden through storms before," Eli replied, but even as he said it, he could feel the electric tension building in the air. "Not like this one," Awanata said, approaching them with her hands extended slightly, feeling her way around obstacles that existed only in her mind. "This storm has been building for days. It will wash out the arroyos and flood the low places. Even the desert knows when to seek shelter." As if summoned by her words, the first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the dry earth with sounds like scattered applause. The villagers quickly began securing loose items and reinforcing their dwellings. In the desert, flash floods were as dangerous as any human enemy. "You may use the small shelter near the corral," the elder said, gesturing toward a simple adobe structure. "But know that hospitality comes with expectations. You will not bring trouble to our village." "I don't want trouble for anyone," Eli said, and meant it. "Want and get are different things," the elder replied, "especially for a man whose face appears on wanted posters." Eli's blood went cold. You've seen. I have seen many things in my years, including the difference between a man who kills for pleasure and one who kills to protect. The elder's eyes were sharp despite his age. The question is, what will you do when those who hunt you find this place? The rain began in earnest then, transforming the desert from a place of dust and heat into a landscape of rushing water and cool air. Eli secured his horse in the small corral and took refuge in the adobe shelter, which was barely large enough for a bedroll and his few possessions. Through the single window, he could see the village transforming as water found every depression and carved new temporary rivers through the landscape. He was arranging his gear when a soft knock came at the door. Awanata stood in the doorway, a clay pot in her hands and a woven blanket draped over her shoulders. "I brought coffee," she said, stepping inside without invitation. "The rain will last through the night, and sleeplessness is hard to bear alone." The shelter felt even smaller with both of them inside, but Eli found himself grateful for the company. Awanata moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world through senses other than sight, settling cross-legged on the floor and pouring coffee from the pot into 2 cups. "Tell me about the soldiers," she said as she handed him a cup. Eli nearly choked on his first sip. "What soldiers?" "The ones you killed. The ones who made you a fugitive." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "I can feel the weight of their deaths in the way you carry yourself. But I also feel the weight of the lives you saved. The children." Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, and Eli felt something inside him crumble like an old wall finally giving way to pressure. "How do you know about the children?" "Because that's who you are," Awanata said simply. "Someone who would sacrifice everything to protect the innocent. Tell me what happened." And so, as the storm raged outside and the small shelter became a confessional, Eli told her. He spoke of the patrol that had discovered the Apache family traveling through what the army considered forbidden territory. He described the soldiers' intentions, their casual cruelty, and the moment when he realized that his uniform wouldn't protect him from the choice he had to make. "I killed 3 men to save a woman and her 2 children," he finished, his voice barely audible above the rain. "The army called it murder, said I had no authority to interfere with military operations." "And the women and children?" "Safe. Last I heard, they made it to the reservation." Eli stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "But their safety cost me everything I thought I was." Awanata was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her cup for warmth. "In our tradition, we believe that every soul carries both light and shadow. The light grows stronger not by avoiding difficult choices, but by making them for the right reasons, even when the cost is high." "The cost was too high," Eli said. "I can never go home, never have a normal life. I'm a wanted man until the day I die." "You're a man who chose love over law," Awanata corrected. "That's not a burden to carry. That's a gift to treasure." She reached across the small space between them, her fingers finding his hand with unerring accuracy. Her touch was warm and strong, calloused from work, but gentle in its intention. "I lost my sight to fever when I was 7, she said. "For months, I raged against the darkness. I felt like the world had been stolen from me. But gradually, I learned to see in new ways. I learned to read the language of heartbeats, to understand the music in people's voices, to feel the emotions that they try to hide. I learned that sight isn't about eyes. It's about understanding." "And what do you understand about me?" Eli asked, surprised by his own boldness. "I understand that you're tired of running. I understand that you've forgotten how to hope. And I understand that you have a heart worth saving, even if you've given up on it yourself." The rain continued through the night, but inside the small shelter, something new was growing between them, fragile as a desert flower, but rooted in mutual recognition of shared pain and unlikely possibility. Dawn broke clear and bright, the desert washed clean by the night's rain. Temporary streams still carved through the landscape, but they were already beginning to disappear as the earth gratefully absorbed every drop. Eli emerged from the shelter to find the village buzzing with quiet activity as people assessed the storm's aftermath and began the work of restoration. Awanata was helping her grandfather examine a damaged wickiup when Eli approached, leading his horse. The animal looked better after a night's rest and adequate water, though still showed signs of hard travel. "The storm has passed," Eli said, unnecessarily stating the obvious. "Some storms pass," Awanata replied, her hands never pausing in their work. "Others are just beginning." Her grandfather looked up from his examination of the damaged structure, his weathered face grave. Riders approached during the night. They made camp in the rocks above the valley. Military men, by the look of their horses. Eli's hand instinctively moved to his gun. "How many?" "6. Maybe 7. They wait for full light before approaching." The elder's eyes were sharp with concern. "They are here for you." The weight of inevitability settled on Eli's shoulders like a familiar coat. He had known this moment would come eventually. He had hoped for more time, but the desert rarely gave anyone what they hoped for. "I'll leave," he said immediately. "Lead them away from here." "The arroyos are still running with water," Awanata pointed out, "and your horse is in no condition for a hard ride. They would catch you within the hour." "Then I'll face them here," Eli said, his voice taking on the flat tone of a man preparing for violence. "But I won't let them hurt anyone in this village." "There's another way," the elder said quietly, "but it would require trust. From all of us." Before Eli could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. The military patrol rode in formation, their uniforms sharp despite the desert dust, their weapons ready but not openly threatening. Leading them was a young lieutenant with the kind of eager expression that spoke of fresh promotion and rigid adherence to orders. The villagers gathered in the central area, their faces carefully neutral. Eli noticed that several of the younger men had positioned themselves with easy access to weapons, while the women and children had moved closer to the shelter of the buildings. It was a dance of apparent submission that masked careful preparation. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison," the young officer announced as he dismounted. "We're looking for a fugitive named Eli Hayes. We have information that he was seen in this area." The elder stepped forward, his bearing dignified despite his simple clothing. "I am Joseph Begay, elder of this village. We have no knowledge of this man you seek." Morrison's eyes swept the gathered villagers, pausing on Eli, who stood slightly apart from the main group. Eli had removed his hat and let his hair fall forward, partially obscuring his face, but he knew the disguise was thin at best. "You," Morrison said, pointing at Eli. "What's your name?" "Thomas," Eli replied, using the first name that came to mind. "I'm a trader. Came through yesterday before the storm hit." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper. The wanted poster, Eli realized with a sinking heart. His face stared back at him from the crude sketch, recognizable enough to be damning. "Funny thing," Morrison said, his voice taking on a suspicious edge. "This trader looks remarkably like our fugitive." Before Eli could respond, Awanata stepped forward. Her movement was fluid and confident, and she positioned herself between Morrison and Eli with the protective instinct of someone defending family. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy of someone who had learned to navigate the dangerous waters between cultures. "You speak of a fugitive, but we know only of Thomas, who has been my husband for 3 years." The lie was delivered with such conviction that even Eli almost believed it. Morrison's expression shifted to one of confusion, then skepticism. "Your husband," he repeated. "Yes," Awanata said, reaching back to find Eli's hand with practiced ease. "We live in the traditional way. He travels to trade. I remain with my people. It is our custom." Morrison looked from Awanata to Eli, clearly struggling with this unexpected development. "If he's your husband, you won't mind if we search his belongings?" "Of course not," Awanata replied smoothly. "But perhaps you could tell us why the army is so interested in a simple trader?" It was a clever deflection, and Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain his mission without revealing details that might compromise it. As he struggled with his answer, Eli noticed that several of the villagers were watching the exchange with expressions that suggested they were ready to support Awanata's deception. "We believe this man may have information about a crime," Morrison said finally. "3 soldiers were killed at Fort Sumner 2 months ago. We're investigating all possible leads." "A terrible tragedy," Joseph Begay interjected. "But surely you can see that Thomas is not the man you seek? He is known to us, welcomed among us, a man of peace." Morrison's jaw tightened with frustration. The wanted poster was clear enough, but the confident testimony of the villagers was creating doubt. Military justice relied on certainty, and uncertainty was dangerous ground for a young officer. "I'll need to verify this with my superiors," he said finally. "We'll make camp nearby while I send a wire to headquarters." "Of course," Joseph Begay replied. "But I hope you understand that our village has no facilities for guests. We are a simple people with simple needs." It was a polite way of saying that the soldiers were not welcome to stay in the village itself, and Morrison clearly understood the message. He remounted his horse, his expression grim. "We'll return tomorrow," he said, "and if there are any inconsistencies in your story, there will be consequences." As the patrol rode away, Eli felt the tension in the village remain high. The immediate danger had passed, but they had bought time, not freedom. "Why?" he asked Awanata as the villagers began to disperse. "Why did you lie for me?" She turned toward him, her unseeing eyes somehow finding his face with perfect accuracy. "Because sometimes the truth is too dangerous to tell, and love is the only lie worth believing." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge and a promise. Love. It was a word Eli had almost forgotten, a concept that seemed as foreign as the idea of a peaceful future. But as he looked at Awanata's face, illuminated by the desert sun and marked by determination, he began to understand that some truths were worth any risk. The evening brought a tension that had nothing to do with approaching storms. The military patrol had made camp in the rocks above the valley, their fires visible against the darkening sky, like hostile stars. In the village below, the people went about their evening routines, but Eli could feel the undercurrent of anxiety that ran through every conversation and gesture. He sat with Awanata by the stream, the water now running clear and peaceful after the previous night's violence. She had insisted on this moment of quiet, claiming that difficult decisions required peaceful hearts. "They'll be back tomorrow," Eli said, stating the obvious because silence felt too heavy to bear. "Yes," Awanata agreed. "And tomorrow we must choose between truth and safety." "There's no choice," Eli said firmly. "I won't let your people suffer for my mistakes. I'll tell Morrison who I am and face whatever comes." Awanata's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "And what comes will be a military tribunal and a hanging. Is that the justice you believe in?" "It's the justice the law demands." "The law," Awanata said, "is not always the same as justice. You know this. You lived it when you chose to protect those children." They were interrupted by the approach of Joseph Begay, who moved with the quiet urgency of someone bearing difficult news. He settled beside them on the bank, his weathered face grave in the starlight. "There's news from the patrol," he said without preamble. "One of my young men was hunting in the hills today. He overheard the soldiers talking. They have orders to bring you back dead or alive, with a preference for dead." Eli felt the familiar cold weight of inevitability settling in his stomach. Then it settled. "I'll leave tonight. Head deeper into the desert. Maybe I can." "No," Awanata interrupted, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised him. "There's another way. But it requires trust, and it requires courage." Joseph Begay nodded slowly. "My granddaughter speaks of the old paths, the ways our people used before the white man's roads carved up our land. There are places the army cannot follow, paths that exist only for those who understand the desert's language." "And you would guide me?" Eli asked, hardly daring to hope. "Not me," the elder said, his eyes moving to Awanata. "Her. She knows the desert better than anyone, blind or sighted. She can lead you to safety." Eli looked at Awanata in amazement. "You would leave your home, your people?" "My people will always be my people," she replied. "But home is not a place. It's a feeling, and I have found that feeling with you." The simple declaration struck Eli like a physical blow. In all his years of running, fighting, and surviving, he had never imagined that someone might choose to share his uncertain fate. The idea was both terrifying and wonderful. The journey would be dangerous, he said, trying to give her an escape from her own generosity. We'd be fugitives together. There would be no guarantee of safety, no promise of a future. The only guarantee in life is uncertainty, Awanata said with a smile that seemed to illuminate the darkness around them. And I have learned to navigate uncertainty better than most. Joseph Begay stood, his decision made. Then it is settled. You will leave before dawn, while the soldiers sleep. I will provide supplies and guidance for the first part of your journey. After that, you must trust in the desert and in each other. And your village? Eli asked. What happens when Morrison discovers we're gone? We will tell him the truth, the elder said with a slight smile. That the trader named Thomas left with his wife to continue their journey. If he chooses to believe that Thomas and Eli Hayes are the same man, that is his burden to carry. As they prepared for their departure, Eli felt the strange sensation of his life dividing into before and after. Before this moment, he had been a man running from his past. After this moment, he would be a man running toward a future he had never dared to imagine. The village helped them prepare in the quiet way of people who understood that some departures were necessary for survival. Supplies were gathered, maps were drawn in the dirt and memorized, and advice was given about water sources and safe caves. Through it all, Awanata moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had made peace with her decision. Are you afraid? Eli asked her as they made final preparations. Yes, she admitted without hesitation. But I have learned that fear is not the absence of courage. It is the presence of something worth protecting. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern mountains, Eli and Awanata set out on foot, leading a single pack horse loaded with supplies. They moved through the desert with the confidence of people who understood that survival depended on patience, preparation, and faith in each other's abilities. Behind them, the village began to stir with the activities of a normal day. Joseph Begay would tell Lieutenant Morrison that the trader and his wife had left early to avoid the heat of the day. It was a simple explanation that had the virtue of being partially true. As they walked, Awanata's hand rested lightly on Eli's arm, but her guidance was more spiritual than physical. She navigated by the sound of their footsteps on different types of ground, by the feel of the wind and the smell of water, by instincts that had been honed by years of living in harmony with the desert. Where are we going? Eli asked as they climbed a rocky slope that seemed to lead nowhere. To a place where the army cannot follow, Awanata replied. A place where Apache and Cowboy are just words, and Eli and Awanata are the only names that matter. Hours later, as the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, they paused at the top of a ridge that overlooked a vast expanse of desert. Behind them, the village was already invisible, swallowed by the heat haze and distance. Ahead lay a landscape of endless possibility and endless danger. Do you regret it? Eli asked, looking at Awanata's face as she turned toward the horizon she could not see. Regret choosing love over safety? Regret choosing truth over convenience? Regret believing that two people can create their own justice when the world offers them none? She smiled, and in that smile, Eli saw the answer to every question he had never known how to ask. No, she said simply. I regret only that it took so long to find you. As they continued their journey into the unknown, Eli realized that for the first time in years, he was not running from something. He was running toward something, toward a future that had no guarantees except the promise that whatever came, they would face it together. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but also patient and full of hidden possibilities. In its silence, they found a space to write their own story. In its harsh beauty, they found the strength to believe that love could indeed conquer the distance between two very different worlds. Behind them, Lieutenant Morrison would discover their absence and spend days searching for tracks that led nowhere. The army would eventually classify Eli Hayes as disappeared, presumed dead in the desert. The wanted posters would fade and be replaced by newer crimes and newer fugitives. But in the hidden places where the desert keeps its secrets, where water flows in underground streams and life persists in the most unlikely circumstances. A blind Apache woman and a haunted cowboy built a life together. It was a life measured not in years or possessions, but in moments of perfect understanding, in shared laughter over simple meals, in the quiet comfort of two people who had found their home in each other. They discovered that sight was not about eyes, but about the ability to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. They learned that home was not a place on a map, but a feeling of belonging that could be carried anywhere. Most importantly, they proved that love was not blind, but the clearest vision of all. The desert had given them what it gave to all who truly understood its nature, the space to become who they were meant to be, and the time to discover that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a destination, but with the courage to walk into the unknown with someone whose heart sees the same horizon. Years later, travelers in the remote corners of New Mexico would sometimes tell stories of a couple who lived in the deep desert, far from roads and towns and the complications of civilized life. They spoke of a woman who could find water in the driest places, and a man who could read the weather in the flight of birds. Some said the woman was blind but could see the future. Others claimed the man was a ghost, a fugitive who had learned to become part of the desert itself. The stories varied with each telling, as desert stories always do. But they all agreed on one thing, that somewhere in the vastness of the American Southwest, love had found a way to flourish in the most unlikely soil, proving that the heart's truest compass points not toward safety, but toward the courage to follow where it leads. And in the end, that was the only direction that mattered. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.